of the previous message.
There are at least 54 Gospels. We've been blessed with the 4 right ones. There are at least 54. 50, in other words, besides ours. All written somewhere between the 2nd and 6th centuries. And then I'm going to add in my own comment, possibly as early as the 1st to the 6th century. Although it doesn't seem like a lot of people believe that. Luke's account proves my statement right away. Whether they ended up as pseudepigrapha or whether they were true to the best of their ability and not adding any fanciful legends or anything, we don't know. But he does speak of those. So let's say anywhere from the 1st to the 6th century, with a surprising number of them that are early. By that I mean 1st and 2nd century A.D. Most of these, as well as most of the other pseudepigraphal works, are just filled with fanciful, exaggerated stories. You see, nothing is wrong. Nothing is wrong at all. Luke doesn't seem to think that anything's wrong with various people who have sat down and tried to compose some gospel, a narrative account of the life of Christ. Let's just say you were living back then, and you're a disciple of Jesus, and you want a record of that in written form, because the written word carries on a lot longer than just trying to memorize all these things. So you sit down and write one. There's really nothing wrong with that. You'd make mistakes. There's no doubt about that. You'd make mistakes. It's another thing when you purposely add in fanciful, exaggerated, heretical stories about Jesus and his early life or Paul's later life or something like that. That's why we discuss them under the pseudepigraphal works, and that's why they're damaging. They weren't just an honest attempt to give us an account of history by a reliable historian, but exaggerated accounts of what took place. Let's study the infancy ones first. We'll look under these 2 categories. The infancy ones first, and then the passion ones, and then we might have one or so that really don't fit in any of those categories. Okay, there are many Gospels just called infancy Gospels, just by that name, or infancy. Nobody knows exactly how many, because nobody knows, when you've got, let's say, a couple of fragments, whether those really are part of the same work, but you're dealing with a quotation from the 14th chapter of it, and you're dealing with a quotation from the 2nd chapter, and we don't have 2 infancy Gospels here, we only have one. Nobody really knows, but this is a chief one, just known as the infancy Gospel, that deals with some of the following things. By the way, it's Gnostic, and it contains Gnostic heretical elements as well. But it's known for the following things. It's known for the fact that when Jesus was first born, he jumped up in the cradle and told everybody he was the Son of God. Well, we laugh about that, but think about that. Did he know he was the Son of God on the day he was born? You think so? You say no? Well, see, we'd want to write a book now to explain which position is right or wrong here. Did he know he was the Son of God? I mean, could he just... That's the question. Could he just jump up and say, I'm God's son? Could he figure out a mathematical equation? In other words, did he grow at all in strength and wisdom and stature? I think Luke says that he did. Well, if you grow in wisdom and stature and favor with God and with men, you had to grow from a point where you didn't either have very much or anything at all. In other words, we're back to this interesting question. Some of you are trying to make him just super God. But was he not a man like we are men? How much of an identity, how much of a parallel do we have there? See, we're dealing with a profound theological question now. And it's not answered in the Bible for us. In so many words, it's not answered for us there. But it's a profound theological question that anyone who's thought, maybe you haven't thought, anyone who's thought would like to know. What could he do? Could he arm wrestle his father when he was a day old? And win? Did he recognize, my name is Jesus Christ, and I was born in this little town here, and I know what the year is, and there's Mom and Dad, and my Father's in heaven, and here's my brothers and sisters. Oh, they're coming along later. We'll get to an account of that here in a moment. Was Joseph married before? Now he's remarried to Mary. So here are my brothers and my sisters. And That's a donkey over there. I created that donkey. I made that donkey. In this world, I made this world. Did he think like that? So he jumps up in the cradle, I'm God. The umbilical cord was saved as a holy relic. This is all in the infancy gospel. Pseudepigrapha. Pseudepigrapha is almost more interesting than the Apocrypha because it's just outlandish. The umbilical cord was saved by Mary and passed down to generations. Some local Catholic church, I'm sure, has it somewhere. Babies were healed whenever Jesus' diapers touched them. Well, remember whenever people touched the hem of his garment. What made him special then? Can you touch his diaper and get healed? Think about that. Ask yourself that question. Could you have in faith touched his diaper as a 1-day-old and been healed? See, you're just stuck. You don't know whether, well, I can see where you could say yes, and I could see where you could say no. And I could see where you get in a lot of trouble either way you go. So the best thing to do is have someone write a book about it to explain it to us. So the infancy gospel, we have that in manuscript form, and multitudes of other childhood miracles that were worked. Those are probably some of the more outstanding ones. The Nativity of Mary, another gospel, another infancy gospel. The Nativity of Mary. It's a book that promotes Mariolatry because she had a miracle birth like her son had. See, right away, if you knew some things about Jesus, this is a late book. Maybe as late as the 6th century A.D. The others, it's just hard to say, but this appears to be a late one. That promotes Mary worship because of her miraculous birth. If you knew Jesus, you'd want to know something about his relatives as well. And if his mother, think of all the thousands of Jews, thousands of young Jewish women God could have picked to bear the Messiah. What was so special? What was unique about Mary? Why did he pick Mary and not someone else? Must have been because Mary was somehow very holy or spiritual or special, or maybe she came down from heaven as well. See, problems with things like that would be, well then, what about someone before that, and before that, and before that? And there'd be no period to that. Then we have the Proto-Evangelion of James. Spelled pretty much like it sounds, pronounced many different ways. The Proto-Evangelion of James. Now, James was somehow supposed to be related to Jesus, whether half-brother, cousin, full brother, theological debate. But in the Proto-Evangelion of James, he gives the accounts of both the miraculous birth of Mary and Jesus, but it's from his perspective, from his point of view. So each one is going to be different, you see, than another because it's by a different author. The Gospel of Joseph the Carpenter. Now there is one man we don't know a whole lot about if you read your New Testament. We're told a lot more about Mary than we are about Joseph. So we'll have to have a little information about Joseph. Evidently someone felt Joseph had been slighted. Everybody's worshiping Jesus and half of the people are worshiping Mary and everybody forgets Joseph. So this was a book that glorified Joseph as Jesus' father, as the one who taught him the law and who brought him up spiritually and brought him up correctly, and therefore he's worthy of, well, if Mary's worthy of worship, then so is Joseph. Joseph died when he was 111 years of age, according to this gospel account. And what really makes this one interesting is it appears that Muhammad, the false prophet of the Islamic faith, this was the gospel that he had. And some of the very sentences in this gospel can be found in the Quran, or the Koran. He evidently did not have our canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but he had Joseph. And, of course, it's a spurious, heretical gospel. And therefore some, not a lot, but some of the Islamic faith is built upon Mohammed's use of the Gospel of Joseph the Carpenter, sometimes called the history of Joseph the Carpenter. Well, since it deals with Joseph bringing Jesus up, I put it here under an infancy gospel. Something else interesting about this, probably the most famous story remembered from this, is the day that Jesus tried to learn his alphabet. This is told all in the account here. And Joseph was teaching him the alphabet. And so he came to Jesus and says, now, boy, say Alpha. And so he says Alpha, Greek, not ABCs, but your Greek alphabet. So he says Alpha. I mean, did he have to learn that at one time? We're back to that question again.
Amen.
Did he already know his ABCs before he was even born? He inspired the tongue of man. He created man's tongue, gave him language and everything. And he said Alpha. And he said, say Beta. And he said no. And so it was the first time that he refused to do something that his father told him to do. First time that he was allegedly a bad boy, because his father said, say Beta, and he said no. And his father said, why? And he said, because I want to know what Alpha means. If you tell me what Alpha means, then I'll say Beta. And so they had to go through each letter of the alphabet step by step, telling him mystically and gnostically what Alpha represented. You just say, well, an Alpha is an Alpha, and an A is an A. But A, that really means, worship of the third rank of angels is what is hidden behind this letter here. So there's a hidden meaning behind every letter that Joseph taught Jesus as he was growing up. The Gospel of the Ebionites. You'll have to become familiar with them later in church history. It's a Christian Jewish heretical sect, the first few centuries A.D., that taught Old Testament doctrine. Old Testament liturgy was still valid for the Christian. So we could say they were the hyper-conservatives at the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15. Probably their forefathers were there anyway. That the Old Testament practices are still valid for today. Another one, the Gospel of Matthew. This is besides our canonical one. The Gospel of Matthew. What does Matthew give? We're talking about infancy accounts. What does Matthew give that no one else gives? Testing your Bible knowledge. Luke gives a genealogy. Going into Egypt. Matthew's the only one. So what happened while he was in Egypt? You see, no one tells us. And the only one who tells us that he went there is Matthew. So since Matthew evidently was the only one who knew that he went to Egypt, probably Matthew would know what was going on down there. So, and this was famous among the early Egyptian Christians, this pseudepigraphal Gospel of Matthew, because it gives all the details of his stay in Egypt, where he stayed, what he did, what he ate, all the details of his stay in Egypt. See, it makes a lot of sense. Curiosity, I'm telling you, curiosity is the major thing that got all of this going. People wanting some more material, more details to be supplied to fit in between the lines of the biblical account. And as I said earlier, that to me is what makes the New Testament speak so strongly for itself, is somehow all the authors of the Old and the New, they don't go into vain speculation, for they have the perfect opportunity to go into giving us all these things. They never do that. The only people who do that are the people who come later and try to rewrite the Bible then and add in their own interpretation. Then we have the Arabic Gospel of Christ's childhood. The Arabic Gospel of Jesus' childhood. This also deals with Egypt, but it deals with the miracles, the childhood miracles he performed in Egypt. And then we're probably to the most interesting one, and that is the Gospel of Thomas, the infancy Gospel of Thomas. I said I'd call it by that to keep it distinguished from the other that fits in the category really of the logia, or the onchyrhynchus sayings of Jesus. The infancy Gospel of Thomas gives a Gnostic view of the boyhood miracles of Christ. And it covers his years from when he was 5 until he was 12. And I'm going to read part of this to you. You've probably heard of a little bit of this before. It's one of the infancy gospels, but it's the infancy gospel of Thomas. It's very short, if I remember correctly, only about 3 chapters or so. I'll start back at the very beginning. I, Thomas, this is to give you a good sample of what pseudepigrapha work would sound like, since you know what the books of the Apocrypha read like. I, Thomas, an Israelite, judged it necessary to make known to our brethren among the Gentiles the actions and miracles of Christ in his childhood, which our Lord and God Jesus Christ wrought after his birth in Bethlehem in our country, at which I myself was astonished, the beginning of which was as follows. When the child Jesus was 5 years of age, it goes from 5 to 12, there had been a shower of rain which was now over, and Jesus was playing with the other Hebrew boys by a running stream. So you'd like an account like that to make him look more real. And the water running over the banks stood in little lakes, but the water instantly became clear and useful again. He, having smote them only by his word, they readily obeyed him. So it turned muddy water into clear water because they didn't want to play with the muddy water or whatever. Then he took from the bank of the stream some soft clay, and formed out of it 12 sparrows, and there were other boys playing with him. But a certain Jew, seeing the things which he was doing, namely his forming clay into the figures of sparrows on a Sabbath day, went presently away and told his father Joseph, and said, Behold, thy boy is playing by the riverside, and has taken clay and formed it into 12 sparrows, and profaneth the Sabbath. So he was a Sabbath breaker, evidently, from day one. Then Joseph came to the place where he was, and when he saw him, called him and said, Why doest thou that which is not lawful to do on the Sabbath day? Then Jesus, clapping together the palms of his hands, called to the sparrows, and said to them, Go, fly away, and while ye live, remember me. So the sparrows fled away, making a noise. He gave them life. They were just little clay birds. And he snaps his fingers, as it were, and they take off. The Jews, seeing this, were astonished, and went away and told their chief persons what a strange miracle they had seen wrought by Jesus. That's chapter 1. I'll start into chapter 2 and see what it's like. Besides this, the son of Anna the scribe was standing there with Joseph, and took a limb from a willow tree, and scattered the waters which Jesus had gathered into lakes. But the boy Jesus, seeing what he had done, became angry, and said to him, Thou fool, what harm did the lake to thee, that thou shouldest scatter the water? Behold, now thou shalt wither as a tree, and shalt not bring forth either leaves or branches or fruit. And immediately the old man withered all over. So he cursed this man because he messed up his Cowboys and Indians game. Then Jesus went away home, but the parents of the boy came lamenting the misfortune of the youth, and took and carried him. Must have done something to someone else. Another time Jesus went forth into the street, and a boy running by pushed him on the shoulder, at which Jesus, being angry, said to him, Thou shalt go no further. And instantly he fell down dead. He was getting mad at everyone, so he used his miraculous powers to kill people and wither them up. Which when some persons saw, they said, Where was this boy born, that everything which he says presently cometh to pass? Then the parents of the dead boy, going to Joseph, complained, saying, You are not fit to live with us in our city, having such a boy as this. Either teach him that he bless and not curse, or else depart hence from with him, for he kills our children. Then Joseph, calling the boy Jesus by himself, instructed him, saying, Why doest thou such things to injure the people, so that they hate us and prosecute us? But Jesus replied, I know what thou sayest is not of thyself. For thy sake I will say nothing. But they have said these things to thee, and they shall suffer everlasting punishment. And immediately they who had accused him became blind in their eyes. And all they who saw it were exceedingly afraid and confounded, and said concerning him, Whatsoever he saith, whether good or bad, immediately cometh to pass. and they were amazed. When they saw this action of Christ, Joseph arose and plucked him by the ear, at which the boy was angry. And Jesus said to him, Be easy, for if they seek for us, they shall not find us. Thou hast done very imprudently. So forth. Chapter 3 looks like he astonishes people at school with his learning. And chapter 4 looks like a fragment. It's broken off there. Anyway, 4 chapters, or however many. We don't know originally how many it had. But that shows you a little bit of what's going on in some of these pseudepigraphal accounts. Then moving on to the Passion Gospels, those answering some questions about his death. You see, you really wouldn't need one written about his life after baptism by John, because our gospel accounts tell us a lot about what's going on in his life. We have one called the Passing of Mary. The Passing of Mary. 2 years after Jesus' ascension, to tell you the story of what happens here, what the whole gospel is about. 2 years after Jesus' ascension, Mary, as her custom has been, is back at the tomb burning incense and candles and fragrances and spices and worshiping at the door of the tomb, as though the tomb were still containing Christ or something. But she did that every day for 2 years, went and worshipped and burned incense at the tomb. The Jews really began persecuting her more and more as each month went by for doing that, because obviously, if you remember our Acts account, they're not too prone with this Jesus business. So she goes and prays to God, this great trouble that I'm having with the Jews persecuting me. And so, in essence, what happens is she is bodily assumed to heaven, just like Jesus was whenever he went. Thus promoting Mariolatry, again, the worship of Mary. We've got her interesting birth account in the Nativity of Mary, and now how she got to heaven by miraculous assumption, the passing of Mary. Then the Gospel of Nicodemus. The Gospel of Nicodemus describes the sufferings and the death of Christ from his point of view. We would like a book written by Nicodemus, too, since he seemed to know a thing or two about Jesus and the Jewish religion. This book is really made up of 2 other books, one called The Acts of Pilate. And there's another fellow we'd like to know what Pilate really thought and said in the Passion episode. And The Descent into Hell. In chapters 16 through 19 of the Gospel of Nicodemus, we have the story of Jesus going to hell to get Adam and to defeat Satan. Found early, you see, in church history. The Gospel of Nicodemus, Christ ascending to hell to get Adam. Allegedly based on, where is that verse? 1 Peter 3 and verse 19. By which also he went and preached unto the spirits in prison. So Adam was one of those spirits in prison, and Satan was the one who had imprisoned him. So Christ goes, there's a battle in hell, Jesus defeats the devil, and takes Adam and others with him. The Gospel of Nicodemus. Then we've got one that just doesn't seem to fit anywhere, but it's called the Gospel of the Egyptians. And it's an ascetic book. Ascetic teachings against certain types of food and against marriage, kind of like 1 Timothy chapter 4. And maybe one other that would fit here, it's really not Passion, and it's really not infancy, would be the Gospel of the Hebrews. It's a paraphrase of our Gospel of Matthew. It's a paraphrase of our Gospel of Matthew. And I'll mention 2 things about it. One, we're given an account over in 1 Corinthians 15:7 that just mentions in a few words that after Jesus' resurrection, he appeared to James. And it very specifically says James. If you see there in verse 7, he's separated. It says, after that he was seen of James, then of all the apostles. That's the only account. We know nothing more about that besides what we have here until you get outside of the New Testament. And so in the Gospel of Hebrews, we have this account, the whole account of what Jesus said to James and how James responded to him. But again, I'm just pointing that out to show you the aspect of curiosity. You'd see something that you don't think is dealt with enough in the New Testament, and so you write a book about it. And I want to give you a quote from this, a very famous quote from the Gospel of Hebrews. I've seen it later in my notes on love and ethics, where the writer says, never be joyful except when you shall behold your brother with love. Quoted often by the early church fathers. Never be joyful except when ye shall behold your brother with love. And by the way, a lot of these, well, practically all of these pseudepigraphal works are never found in any biblical manuscripts. Say, well, what's the big thing about that? Well, remember, the Old Testament Apocrypha is found in many, many, many biblical manuscripts, in the LXX copies by the Christians. But the pseudepigraphal works never made it into biblical manuscripts. Most of them didn't. And you can just multiply this. The Gospel of Peter, Gospel of the 12, Gospel of Barnabas, Gospel of Andrew, Gospel of Bartholomew, Gospel of Matthias, whatever name you can think of, you almost could put it after Gospel of until you reach about 50 or so. The Gospel of Peter, I'll say one thing about that, and we'll move beyond the Gospels. The Gospel of Peter seems to be the origin for the belief that Joseph had been married to someone prior to Mary. If you're a former Catholic, you know about this good belief that, well, again, the Catholics are almost ascetic in their doctrinal beliefs, although they aren't in their practices, that Mary, once a virgin perpetually, she has to be a virgin. If Mary, the holy, holy, holy Mother of God, had relations with Joseph afterwards, which is what the New Testament seems to imply, and therefore had other children by Joseph after the time of Jesus, well, that would it obviously would hurt the doctrine of her perpetual virginity, but wouldn't that hurt, her spiritual status as well, because she has had carnal relations with some man, and she's supposed to be the Mother of God. So who are these people that are called in the New Testament Jesus' brothers and his sisters? Well, don't you remember from other studies earlier that many times the Old Testament, and you could say, well, it's right over in the New Testament as well, will use terms like son and father and not mean them immediately. In other words, they'll say such and such was the son of someone. Really, we mean great-great-great-grandson, just a descendant of theirs. So maybe we're not supposed to interpret those terms brothers and sisters technically. A technical brother, either full brother, half brother, whatever you want to make it, but cousins. Those were cousins of Christ. It was because we've got an earlier marriage on our hands here. So that seems to be the origin of that delusion that a lot of people believe. Okay, then Acts. We'll get into Acts next. The Acts are not as numerous as the Gospels, but basically they're telling us the stories of the 12 or the 13 apostles. Most of them seem to just vanish from the book of Acts after chapter 1 and verse 13. Peter, James, John, Andrew, Philip, Thomas, Bartholomew, Matthew, James the son of Alphaeus, Simon, Zelotes, and Judas, the brother of James. A whole lot of those, that's the only time you'll see them in Acts, is they're mentioned there in the upper room. What happened to them afterwards? Well, lots of legends. Supposedly Thomas. Where did Thomas go? Anyone know where Thomas went? India. He evangelized the country of India. And that could be true. Someone did. The apostles had some ministry. They didn't just all die the first decade or something. They did go somewhere and do something. But it can't be proven, though. Thomas went to India. Peter was crucified upside down because he felt he was so unworthy of a death similar to his Lord's. Peter was crucified upside down. You ever heard that story before? It comes from these Acts accounts here, these pseudepigraphal Acts accounts, and that could be true. But we don't have a picture of him. We don't have a movie film of him being crucified upside down. Paul, in a book about the Acts of Paul, we learn a description of Paul. Here's what he looked like. This is a quotation. He was a man small in size with meeting eyebrows, with a rather large hooked nose, bald-headed, bow-legged, strongly built, and full of grace. For at times he looked like a man, and at times he had the face of an angel. And if you look at some church paintings of Paul, he's a little bent-over, crooked, hooked-nosed, hawk-nosed, bald-headed creature. That's because of some story passed down. How true is that? Well, you don't want to base any bets on that, because it's not reliable. But maybe he did look like that, someone says. Well, we can't prove it one way or the other, but why should that concern us? For some people, you have to look a certain way before they're going to believe your teaching and your preaching. And that gets over into the carnal aspect, trying to base our beliefs on what Paul looked like. For some people, you have to look a certain way before they're going to believe your teaching and your preaching. And that gets over into the carnal aspect, trying to base our beliefs on what Paul looked like. Paul was the one who said himself in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 that henceforth know we no man after the flesh. He said not even Jesus. We knew him at one time, but henceforth know we no man after the flesh. So it's for a good cause, I'm sure, that we don't have perfect descriptions of the apostles. Peter is supposed to be a robust, strong man, fisherman, used to pulling in those nets and pulling in those ropes. But Paul was a little squawker. He was a studious bookworm, bent over and bad eyesight and all of this because he spent his time studying. He was learning the law the whole time he was growing up. And after getting beat and whipped all the time, well, that'd take a few cubits off your stature probably. So he's a short, hawk-nosed, bald-headed, bow-legged, strongly built creature. How many of you have seen paintings, old pictures? I mean, centuries old, or at least reproductions of them. No one has seen. You've seen Paul? He's not 6'7" or something. He's a bow-legged, ugly-looking creature. But he said sometimes you look like a man and sometimes you look like an angel. Okay, another one. This is a famous one. The Acts of Paul and Thecla. The Acts of Paul and Thecla. Thec or Kla. This has to be the most interesting one of them all. It's told in many different places. I think you got a fairly good account in this book right here, The Church in the Roman Empire by William Ramsey. I think you've got a fairly good account of the story here. We see Paul going in our book of Acts, traveling, preaching, but not a lot of personal details about him. We want something more personal to sink our teeth into. So let me tell you the story. This is a famous story about Paul and Thecla. Thecla was from Iconium. She was from one of the most noble families in Iconium, and she met Paul whenever Paul traveled through there and preached on one of his first journeys. And at the time, she was engaged to be married. She had a fiancé, and she was a fiancé, but of course this was a pagan man. And the pagan soul didn't receive the gospel as she did. She was so captivated by the message of Christianity that she decided to believe the gospel, forsake her fiancé, and travel with the Apostle Paul. Well, she didn't have those plans to begin with as far as traveling with Paul, but she didn't want to be converted. But her relatives stepped in, and her relatives are quite upset that the marriage has fallen through. And so they have Paul expelled from the city of Iconium. And they tell her that she's going to be bound to and then burned at the stake because of her new belief in Christianity. So she's all tied up, although she's wanting to go wherever Paul goes. Really, that's in the back of her mind. It's kind of a semi-love story, you see. She's wanting to go with Paul. She's bound up by the stake. The fire is lit. It's coming at her, and a storm blows up all of a sudden. And it begins to rain, and the rain quenches the fire, and then the rain floods out the town so that all of her enemies are killed, except her, of course. Then she follows Paul to Antioch, and then from that point on, Paul disappears from the story, and then the rest of the story is about this girl named Thecla. She later is again called in Asia Minor, and she's thrown into a pit where there is a lion, a bear, and a lioness, female, of course. The lioness, the latter of those, jumps on the bear and the lion and kills them so that she is preserved there, and finally she's released. The moral, the object of the whole story, is to teach abstinence from marriage. There was kind of a love story there, but she and Paul never actually tied the knot and got married. So it taught an abstinence of marriage, of meat, of wine, and of course it praised absolute virginity. Some of these early notions that very quickly made their way into Roman Catholicism. And you can multiply that, like I said, with Acts of Bartholomew or Thaddeus, whatever you want to call all the apostles on down the line. Okay, then epistles. Epistles. Really, we only have 4 that we're going to deal with. There are not nearly as many of these. This would be the least populated of the 4 categories at which we're looking. Epistles. Well, first of all, we could put a lost Corinthians and a lost Laodiceans here. That is, the forgeries of those. The lost ones are still lost. But there is a forgery of the Colossians 4 epistle to the Laodiceans, and there is a forgery of the 1 Corinthians 5:9 lost book of 1 Corinthians, and of course we have the second one there. So forgeries were made of and from that. We count lost Corinthians, probably 2 lost Corinthians, lost Laodiceans, we count those technically as lost books. But now we're talking about forgeries of those. And I've already brought to you once before the epistle to the Laodiceans, so I don't think I'll read that again. But we'll put those 2 books there. Then we have an epistle from Paul to Seneca, the Roman statesman. From Paul to Seneca, an important Roman official. And Paul writes to him. Seneca's holding a school for a lot of young Roman men, training them. And Paul writes to him recommending Christianity to the group as a good topic to take up and a good experience to have. And then the most famous of the epistles would be the letter of Jesus to a king in Mesopotamia. And we're going to come across this again whenever we get further into Bible translation, so I'll give you the names and everything then. But Jesus is writing a letter. Have you ever wondered, did he ever sit down and write a letter to anyone? He wrote a letter once to the king of Mesopotamia who had written Jesus earlier asking for healing. He was suffering some infirmity. So in this letter of Christ, Jesus responds saying that he's too busy at this time. He's healing too many people in Israel right now. It's too far of a trip to get there. So he says he's too busy right now, but after his resurrection, he said, I will send you one of my apostles to heal you. So that's what that letter is about. Written by the very hands of Jesus, so we're told. And then finally we have our apocalypses. Our apocalypses. We have the apocalypse of Paul, apocalypse of Thomas, apocalypse of Stephen, apocalypse of James. You can go on down the list again. Apocalypses. The apocalypse of Peter maybe is the most important one. The apocalypse of Peter. It gives very vivid pictures of the damned who are tortured in hell, and was the immediate basis for Dante's Inferno. You familiar with that medieval writer and medieval writings? Dante's Inferno. He drew all of his imagery from the Apocalypse of St. Peter. Vivid pictures of the damned. Now, the last one that I've just mentioned, the Apocalypse of Peter, along with the Acts of Paul and Thecla, are in the table of contents in Codex D. That's Codex Bezae. I said very rarely will you find them in biblical manuscripts. They're in the table of contents. And they're both quoted by Clement of Alexandria and by Origen. Clement of Alexandria and Origen quote from the Apocalypse of Peter and the Acts of Paul and Thecla. Okay, where does this leave us then? What does this teach us? Well, I think this whole business of curiosity is probably one of the first and foremost and best things to be taught from a study of the pseudepigraphal writings. As we go along in this church more and more, as you go along in your own Christian life more and more, as you read the Bible more and more, you're going to come to so many passages, probably that you've not seen yet at this time, that you just thought, well, God told everything, and it's just all there, and all the accounts are there, and it's just really easy to understand. And you're going to be surprised to find out how much information is not there, and what a temptation it is to speculate. Say, now, I believe this is what happened. This event happened here, and this well could have been really what took place over here, when really we're given no information at all, or at least not enough to form some theory of what's going on here. A study like we've done this evening and last week should show you what the result is very quickly. When we try to add in something that's really not taught there, but yet we're curious to know. And you can go to such extents and extremes that you'll end up with some of these works here with some of the most ludicrous things, because they're talking about very good logical questions, like the infancy accounts of Christ. It's a very good question, logical question for curiosity seekers. It's a prime question to raise. But to answer it's another matter. To raise it's interesting. To answer it is another matter. If you'll turn back to Genesis, I just want to show you a couple of things here. We could just go throughout the Bible, but I'll only show you things that I've already pointed out before, where the story doesn't tell us enough to draw these conclusions. Really, it doesn't even infer such things. But this Genesis 4:1 account, I've heard this taught by others, but the first time I heard it by a man, I was just floored that he really felt this was taught here in Genesis. Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bare Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. And she again bare his brother Abel. And Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain was a tiller of the ground. I remember hearing the man introduce this story and left it as a cliffhanger for everyone, and people were just buzzing over this new revelation that they had, that Cain and Abel were twins. They were born twins here. Why? Because notice it says that Adam knew Eve, his wife, and then she conceived and bare Cain. Skip the second half of verse 1. And she again bare his brother. Now, it doesn't say there that Adam again knew his wife. So if you only knew her one time, and yet she bore 2 times, and we don't know about a knowing in between times, then do we not have twins on our hands here? Well, that's a reading into the account, though. I mean, that's interesting. That's interesting that they're twins, but the account doesn't say that, though. And just what I've given you, you see, you use your logic and reason and try to build. That's interesting, but you can only build up to a point. You can't get to the conclusion, yes, they're twins. You can say it's interesting that we have the word know once and conceive and bear children twice. That's interesting. Okay, what can we do with it? You can't do anything with that. That doesn't teach us anything. Maybe that word know, you see, you don't know this. Maybe that word know or knew there is to be taken in reference to both of them. It's just a generalization that he had relations with his wife. And then he's not going to tell us all of that again. He expects us to know that. The only way you get children is have relations. So he's not going to tell us that again. You could reason that way, you could reason, but he didn't tell us twice now. So what does he expect us to know? Just that, well, that's obvious? Or what other way could you tell us that these guys were twins right here? Well, I'll tell you one good way you could tell us. Just tell us. Just say they were twins. Amen. That happens later in the book of Genesis when twins were born. We're told these boys were twins here. Amen. We're not told that here. That's one minor account. But you can build and build and build and end up with the most ridiculous thing simply because you're curious about something. So my warning to all of us here is bridle your curiosity. If you want to be in line with the Scripture writers don't satisfy our vain, idle speculations and curiosity. Just bridle it. The Bible generally is not going to deal with these carnal, physical, that don't mean anything anyway, items, but that men are always so curious about. It deals with the important spiritual things, and that's really all we have to know. How a lot of the things were done, we're not told. The crossing of the Red Sea, a wind blew, but a wind doesn't blow water in a certain direction and then make it go in two opposite directions. That doesn't make any sense at all. So how was that really done? The Bible doesn't tell us. The Bible says God worked a miracle. Israel came through on dry land. The Egyptians, assaying to do so, were drowned, and God was praised as a result of that. That's the story. That's the essence of the story. That's the extent of the story. And because the Bible limits itself to that, we have to limit ourselves to that as well. Now, this question about Jesus' cognizance of his divinity in his early period of life, that's a theological question that can be answered. But whenever we get to answering that, then the answer won't be, yes, he could stand up in his crib and shout and praise God all the time. Maybe he was knowledgeable of something, but just because he was knowledgeable doesn't then make these conclusions that he made little clay birds into real sparrows and he struck people dead and he talked to God all day long and blasphemed his mother and his father. It won't lead to conclusions like that. Just because we get to something, then don't someone say to me, does that mean that he could have stood up in his cradle and announced who he was, his telephone number and all of that? If I tell you, if we get to the place in that class where I say now he had complete knowledge of his divinity and everything, then I can't take it any beyond that. I can't say, and then that means that he knew where he was, he knew your name while he was lying in the cradle, and he knew that he had created his mom and his dad. See, I'm trying to say you can learn certain things, but when it comes to these areas of curiosity and speculation, the Bible very clearly avoids even dealing with issues like that, because it gets you all caught up in curiosity and idle speculation on these things. And what will happen? You'll miss the whole spiritual import of various things. I want to show you something else before we wrap up here. In chapter 3, in verse 3, there's been a lot of talk about this. I've seen opposing views, and I think I've given you my view before. I want to show you how something like this maybe would differ a little bit. The woman said to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden." I tell you what, you have to have verses 16 and 17 first. The Lord God commanded the man, saying, "Of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it. For in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die." Now what's the important verb in all of this? Eat. Thou mayest not eat of this certain tree. That's the important verb. Verse 2 then of the next chapter. The woman said to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden. But of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God hath said, Ye shall not eat of it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die." But we don't find that back in verses 16 and 17, that God said, "Neither may ye touch it." So there's been lots of speculation. Luther and Calvin, everybody has their own opinion. Everybody has opinions and they argue against one another. Was Eve adding in something extra? Or did she know something that God had said that just is not told to us back in chapter 2? And why tell us in chapter 2 when you're going to tell us in chapter 3 anyway? As long as we can know what chapter 3 says, that it assumes that that was told back in the days of chapter 2. So what's the answer here? Did God tell them don't touch it? Or did Eve add that in? Well, my opinion has been, and it still is, that God told them don't eat it and don't touch it. For a couple of reasons. Number one, if you get close to sin, you're probably going to sin. So just stay away from it is one good point he's trying to make here. I don't think, in other words, just because he says don't eat, that he means you could have picked that pineapple, that banana, whatever, off of there and rubbed it, looked at it, smelled it, handled it, and then thought, oh, I can't eat it, and throw it away. That doesn't make a lot of sense. He said don't eat, don't touch, don't get near. Well, you say that's just an opinion. That's true, that's just an opinion. And that doesn't prove anything. What seems to prove it to me, though, is that if God did not include this touch prohibition, then Eve is lying, right? She's lying. If God did not say that. That means we have the fall back here in Genesis 3:3, when really we don't have it until down in verse 6. And we know what the whole fall is about, is she took of the fruit and ate of the fruit. Not that she told a lie first. But if you have never fallen, if you are in a pure, innocent, upright state, you can't lie then. You cannot lie. If she would have lied, there's the fall of man back in verse 3 and not in verse 6. So now that to me is an argument that's conclusive. The business of don't get near sin, because if you get near it, you're going to participate in it, that's just, that's kind of a hypothesis, kind of a sub-fortification. So you're going to have to, in other words, before you can really come to conclusions on these things, you're going to have an argument like I just gave you that throws the whole Bible out of kink then, that we really have the fall of the woman back when she told a lie to the devil rather than when she ate of the forbidden fruit. You'll have to have an argument on that level, like with these twins over in Genesis 4 and verse 1 and verse 2, before you really even need to get into the area, or just leave it alone and say, well, we're not given enough information to make up our minds to come to some conclusion on this.